Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 7. We're getting close to the end of this course, so keep at your classwork, keep up with the discussion boards. You guys are doing great, and I've really enjoyed reading your responses on everything and getting to know a little bit about you and what your thoughts on document design are. So today I'm going to be talking about a few different things. This might be broken down into 2 lectures, but first I want to start with one of the Shriver tables that is going to be available for you in the course documents folder. This one's called Evaluating Text Quality, and it's basically a continuum from text-focused to reader-focused methods. And the reason why I want to go over this one is because you need to be using this for your final project, the one that you're going to be working on in groups. So I expect that you'll be using at least one of these methods from each category, and then of course spending your most time in the last category. So let's go ahead and look at the document. I have it up on my screen here. So you can see the first one is text focused. We've already gone over readability formulas a lot. I think you guys have shared a common view that maybe it's not the most helpful thing. There's definitely some situations where readability formulas can be helpful, but as you all have mentioned, we have to take into account user perception. So you can see that we're looking at things like word frequency, word length. There are certain standards that if a word is too long, too many characters, it has a greater possibility of being confused. And then we have length of sentences. Oftentimes, more lengthy sentences may be seen as more complex. So if you're running like multiple lines in a sentence, you may want to consider breaking that down to make it a bit more digestible. Or you may have even seen feedback from me on a paper that I didn't take points off, but I said maybe you want to break this down a little bit more. If it's something that you're going for 5 or 6 lines and you're still on the same thought, you might have to break that thought apart a bit more, or at least include something like a colon or a semicolon, some sort of punctuation that's going to give the reader a break. We also talk about here the computer-based stylistic analysis, and the best way to think about that is think about something like Word that you've probably been using a large portion of your life. That's going to be underlining in green and red squiggles, and by now you know what that means. Maybe the first time you used the program, you weren't sure what the red underline meant or the red squiggle, but now you know, okay, that's probably a word I need to check out. Maybe I typed it wrong, maybe it's a grammatical issue, maybe it's a spelling issue. So that's the easiest way to think of it. Again, not 100% foolproof, misses a lot of grammar. A couple of you have mentioned on the discussion boards the app Grammarly. I'm not too familiar with that other than the ads I've seen, but I would understand that that would be very familiar as well. Maybe it works better than Word. I don't really know. Definitely, if you do have any input on that, let us know on the discussion boards because I would be interested. But it's something that is, again, not going to be 100% foolproof. And then we have guidelines and maxims. And we've talked about this since I think week 1 or week 2 of the course. A lot of companies are going to have their own style guides. They're going to have standards that they want you to follow. And it's basically so that the company looks like they're writing in one voice. You may be employing multiple writers that are writing on the same product. I'm on a current product team that has 5 different writers. So we need to make sure that we're writing as one voice rather than 5 individual writers because that can get really confusing for a user, especially in software where you might start using a different term for a drop down menu and someone else is saying it's a list. So we go through things like style guides to make sure that we have some consistency. And then again, we have checklists. Checklists, think back to the Kosselnick article that we read that had the visual design matrix. That would be an example of employing a matrix. So maybe you want to go through and check things at the intertextual level, or you want to look at more of graphics. What bullets are you doing? Are you doing circles? Are you doing squares? Things like that. Now, moving to the center column, we're looking at expert judgment focused, and that means some sort of a review process that is not involving a machine or a readability formula. So peer review, that's definitely one. A lot of writing teams will review each other's work, and it's something that you might also be asking the person standard questions. Like there's certain questions you want answered by that person. Again, then we have technical or subject matter experts. A lot of times you'll hear them referred to as SMEs. So what you go to a SME for is anything related particularly to that subject matter. So again, going back to the software documentation, if you were documenting a product that had a calculator feature, you would be going to the business analyst or the developer for that area to get an additional information that you need, and also to make sure that what you have is correct, because the last thing you want is something that's incorrect for the user. A lot of times you may be writing while the product is in development, so something could change that you weren't aware of and your steps no longer work. So you'd always be reaching out to those subject matter experts. Editorial review, some teams do employ an editor. That's going to be an official editor, and they oversee all the writers. My department does not do that. We have individual writers who do reviews when time permits. That's going to vary from company to company. Not every company will have an editor. Some of them do, some don't. And then external reviews would be people outside of the company. So think about customers, or maybe even this would still be internal, but like if you went to your support team, anything like that. If you needed an ethical review or a legal review, we do get some of our documentation reviewed by legal teams, especially when you're referring to things like cookies or security and what the company is responsible for versus what the client is responsible for. Those things might require an external review. And then last, we have our reader-focused column, and that's going to be where you guys are spending the most of your time in the next couple of weeks. So for reader-focused, we're talking about doing the different testing. We're talking about keystroke recording. How many times did the user hit backspace, or did they hit enter? What task were they doing at the time? Eye movement protocols. So that's something like if you're having someone complete a task or maybe skim an article, that's a good example. You can actually see where their eyes go. So you can tell when I'm looking down at the article that we're all looking at. So my eyes are no longer looking at the camera, and you can see that I'm kind of scanning across. So the software is going to record that. It's recording the person's eye movement, and that's how we know people tend to skim in an L shape. There's a lot of really interesting studies on it. It's great focus for the annotated bibliography as well. Users tend to skim down to the left. Once they find what they want, they continue going and reading that information. I don't know a lot of companies that do that. It's very interesting research. I wish we had access to more of that, but unfortunately, I don't have much insight into that one. And then we have user edits and performance testing. I think you guys know a lot about that from our last lecture, and the protocol aided revision. So think about the think aloud. So rather than me scrolling down, I would say, now I'm going to scroll down so I can see the rest of the document. That's what you're asking the user to do. You want them to tell you exactly what they're thinking, why they're doing what they're doing with every move they make. And then retrospective testing, obviously that's after they've used the software program. Concurrent testing is testing them while using it. So with retrospective testing, we're looking at doing things like surveys or maybe focus groups. There could be some sort of a comprehension. So you might ask the user something, how did you complete a certain task? Or you might ask them to recall specific information. Do you remember seeing X? Like you might see little surveys that pop up on Facebook and social media that might ask you, do you remember seeing an ad for Subway this week? And if you hit yes, yeah, I think I saw one this week. Or no, I don't really pay attention to the ads. I'm blocking them out for right now. So it's something like that. You're asking them to go back in their memory and recall that information. So I just wanted to go over this because, again, we're going to need to do one from each category. So that's going across the top, one from text focused, one from expert judgment focused, and one reader focused. You can certainly do more than one text focused or expert judgment if you would like to. Reader focused is really going to where you're spending the most of your time when you're doing the survey, when you're doing the live testing. So now I want to go over a couple of slides with you. Again, we're in week 7, which you guys already know. And I want to talk a little bit about Kimball and Hawkins, chapter 7. So they talk about graphics in this chapter, and you might be asking the question, why use graphics at all? Graphics should be used sparingly and only to enhance the content that you already have. So we have two main categories of graphics. We have informational and we have promotional. So information is something like showing relationships, like a quantitative relationship, a spatial relationship, might be showing how something looks, like maybe it's an exploded diagram that's showing you the parts of a whole. We also have showing actions or occurrences related to time. And again, if you go to chapter 7, there's some good examples of that in your textbook. And then we go to promotion, which is usually either branding, well, it is branding, branding with either logos or establishing a visual tone. So one of my examples here is T-Mobile, and I'm not specifically talking about the logo, I'm talking about their color. T-Mobile pink is a very specific color. You might be able to think of some others that are associated with very specific colors. Oracle has red, Target has red. There's these standards, or Tiffany blue, that's a good one. It's actually a copyrighted color. They're supposed to not reproduce it anywhere else. So companies get very interesting when they try to copyright colors, copyright their logos, because they want you to start associating that color with them and with them only. So I want to go and look at a couple of graphics here, and if you pause for a minute, just pause and look at them and see if you think they're information or branding. So hopefully you paused and gave that some thought. And I want to go through the graphics here. So first we have Burt's Bees, which if you're not familiar, they produce products from beeswax, a very natural-based company, or that's what they market themselves as. So that is a branding graphic. Then we have these two somewhat go together. We have Meat Standard Graded Australia, and we have USDA Grade A meat. Now, these are actually both. It's information and it's branding. So it's information because it's conveying something to the reader that this meat is graded meat. So especially in the case of the USDA, it's grade A meat. It's the top level of meat. I'm not too familiar with Australia standards, so I don't know how their graded meat versus ungraded meat would be, but it's also an attempt to brand themselves and market themselves towards you. USDA wants you to trust them. They want you to look at the logo on the package and think, okay, it's reliable information because it's a government agency and they haven't steered me wrong in the past, and everything based on my perception says that I can trust that. So an example I think your textbook gave was USDA organic. There's always arguments over or whether or not something is fully organic or not, but for the most part, people will see the label USDA, see that it's organic, and trust that. And so USDA is trying to build itself up as a brand, gaining your trust, going back to their ethos by building it with logos. And you can kind of see how they're trying to retain customers in that sense. Then, of course, we have the almighty Amazon at the bottom here. That's definitely just for branding. If you went to maybe Amazon Prime, maybe that relays a little bit of information, but I'd say that's still branding for the most part. Then we have a recycling logo at the top, 100% recyclable packaging. That is information. We actually don't know what product this is on. With the paws, I assume it's some sort of a dog food package, but it's something that's recyclable. Here we have Apple. That's, of course, branding. And then we have another one that is information and branding. This is from the Philadelphia Food Trust, and this is the Philadelphia Healthy Corners Store Network. This is something that Food Trust does in neighborhoods around Philadelphia to inform customers of healthy decisions. So again, that's something that's information and it's branding.